Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Welcome to another installment of Through the Ages, where we look at how civilizations in Age of Empires 2 have changed between their initial bonuses and text at release versus today. In this video, we're going to look at the forgotten DLC additions, which brought us the Eastern European architecture, that is, Magyars and Slavs. I remember when I first picked up the Forgotten DLC in 2013, these were two civs I would sometimes confuse in the early days, maybe partly because they shared their architecture and both had good cavalry. But with the benefit of hindsight, I think are most interesting as a contrast, with Magyars not directly receiving an eco bonus at all, and Slavs having arguably the second best eco bonus in the game after Vikings. We'll start things off though first with the Magyars. At release, their bonuses were fairly similar to how they are today, keeping in mind all of the Forgotten DLC civilizations were maybe a little underpowered to begin with. Their villagers killed wolves in one attack, they received the melee blacksmith upgrades for free after building a blacksmith, the Magyar light cavalry line was discounted by 10%, and while their unique techs were superficially similar to today, both had notable changes. Their team bonus was back then foot archers gaining +2 line of sight, which is of course now a cavalry archer training speed boost. You could credibly argue every single one of these bonuses and techs is better now than it was originally, with one exception. While one-shotting wolves is probably one of the most forgotten or overlooked bonuses in the game today, it was a much bigger deal originally, as the number of wolves on all maps, as far as I know, was greater back then. In August 2020, the devs significantly cut down on the number of wolves spawning, which used to be not just a considerable threat to militia or tower rushing villagers, but even regular old walling in Dark Age was dangerous without loom, or a buddy system of two villagers working together. Notably, their unique unit, the Magyar Hussar, cost 80 food and 10 gold, instead of the now 35 food and 45 gold, though just like today, their Castle Age unique tech changed them into costing a flat 80 food. Now you can't talk about the early Magyars between 2013 and 2015 without mentioning their best known at the time enthusiastic supporter. You have to remember this was in the context of a much smaller AoE2 community back then, where less than half of players even owned the DLC. It was a period where being a passionate advocator in YouTube comment sections, Twitch chat, and every Reddit thread for a DLC civilization would get you a reputation, and there was a self-branded Magyar superfan at the time, Fresh Princess of Belarus. Outside of her and a top 100 player named Feanor, both of whom really seemed to like the Magyars and talk them up as underrated whenever possible, the rest of the fanbase, as far as I can tell, did not think the civilization was particularly good at release. The general perception was they didn't have a strong enough scout rush, they had no gunpowder, the weakest siege in the game, some high ceiling cavalry archers with extra range but were generic in Castle Age, and crucially didn't have a straightforward eco bonus. If you liked playing scouts into cavalry archers, it was hard to justify picking them over Mongols or Huns, and while we didn't have stats for Magyars at the time, they were almost certainly in the bottom 5. The major piece of evidence for that is even after a massive overhaul, they weren't top tier when the stats did come out, and the devs also presumably had access to stats prior to those becoming public, and chose to massively buff Magyars. So again, the idea they were a hidden gem or underrated at release doesn't really track with hindsight. For that reason, in 2017, with patch 5.5, Magyars received a series of buffs, bringing them much closer to their strength today. The melee blacksmith upgrades came in immediately instead of requiring a blacksmith to be built first, meaning you could delay your blacksmith when going scouts while still picking off villagers in one less attack. They received siege engineers, raising them out of the position of having clearly the worst siege in the game to that point. Their scout cavalry discount increased to 15%, and recurve bow gave their cavalry archers +1 attack in addition to range. Immediately, the perception changed to Magyars having arguably one of the strongest scout rushes in the game, though the earliest win rate stats a year or two later still only put them ranking 21st out of 31 civs on Arabia, so not bottom tier, but a little lower than they are today. Certainly the top player Feanor loved the changes. This brings us to Definitive Edition, which was a time for a lot of civs to receive balanced shakeups, though Magyars managed to dodge changes like the devs were missing ballistics. The only thing Magyars received for 6 years after their 2017 overhaul was a renaming of their unique tech mercenaries into Corvinian army. Finally, in June 2023 though, they had to change their archer line of sight team bonus, switching to faster creation of cavalry archers, further pushing those as a strong option. A few months later, the Magyar Hussar then had a bit of a rework, gaining 5 more HP in Castle Age and having its cost tilted much more heavily into gold. That might sound like a nerf, but the unique tech was then modified so they ended up with the same 80 food cost, meaning they weren't really hurt in the late game. And keep in mind, it's quite a bit easier and faster to generate gold than food in Castle Age. So if anything, the tech just became more important later, and they were a bit easier to make in the mid-game. Still, I should point out knights are by far the more popular cavalry option for Magyars, as they don't need castles and still get free +2 attack. That brings us to the Magyar state today, where they're a very solid open map civ, seeming to work best at lower elos, and having a very strong scout rush, though with a bit weaker mid-game. Technically, they're the third most popular civ across all maps, so Fresh Princess of Belarus appears to have indeed been quite a bit ahead of her time, unfortunately moving on from AoE 2 it seems in 2016, before the Magyars surge in popularity. Depending on your interpretation, they still technically lack a direct eco bonus, making them somewhat unusual, as well as the perfect foil for our next civilization, their Eastern European counterparts, the Slavs. Now, Slavs are far less popular by play rate, but were at times the much stronger of the two civs, in fact at one point vying for the title of the best civ in the game. At release, they had their signature bonus of farmers working 15% faster, though more on that in a moment, as well as free tracking, which is now a tech given for free to all civilizations in Feudal Age, with then Siege Workshop units being 15% cheaper, same as today. One of their unique techs though is now a Bengali civ bonus, but their other unique tech and team bonus were the same as they are presently. The unique unit, the Boyar, carries on with its initial concept of a high melee armor cavalry unit, but back then had a higher gold cost, lower armor, and took much longer to train, so were overall a bit worse than they are now. Slavs instead though have always had their identity primarily based around their farming boost, which you wouldn't know now, but initially had two big problems with its implementation that had to be overcome, making it originally just a shadow of its strength today. The first problem was the devs initially just set the farmer's work rate to 18% faster than usual, though of course villagers walk around the farm and back and forth to a town center or mill with so much of their time, that meant the bonus only did about half of what it was supposed to, and the devs quickly realized that and corrected to 31% and then 28% faster farming work rate, which after factoring in walking time turned into roughly 15% more food gathered. So far so good. The second problem that then appeared was based on a mechanic that was unbeknownst to me at the time, and presumably the Forgotten Empire's team as well, which was that farms themselves only generated food that could be collected at 24 food per minute, which Slavs' faster farming bumped up against quite early. With Wheelbarrow, they only ended up being about 7 to 10% faster than other civilizations, and with Handcart for a while had no advantage over a generic civilization. So when all was said and done, they came out being much worse than advertised in the mid to late game, as your main equal bonus basically stopped working when playing Slavs past a point. This was addressed a few years later in 2018, when the farm cap of 24 itself was raised by the bonus, and Slavs finally received plus 15% through the whole game, instantly making them top tier despite nothing official changing about them. A year later, in early 2019, the first public win rate data was coming out on AoEstats.io using ladder results, and it was confirmed that Slavs were in fact number 2 by win rate at 57%, behind only the Franks. Slavs were a monster in the mid-game especially, mostly thanks to superpowered farming into cavalry, though cheaper siege is pretty solid in the mid-game as well. They were clearly too strong going into Definitive Edition though, and with win rate data now public, the whole fanbase knew it, so it wasn't a surprise when Slavs were hit in the initial Definitive Edition patch with a drop to just 10% faster farming across the board. This is also when tracking was given to all civilizations, and supplies was added to the game, with Slavs gaining that for free, as well as a training time reduction for the Boyar. Maybe surprisingly, the farming nerf only brought them down to number 5 on the ladder shortly after, so they were still good, if maybe a little less overpowered. At this point though, even if they were still a well-performing civ, and now free for everyone to play without buying a DLC, they became surprisingly unpopular. A video I made looking at the greatest disconnects between win and play rate at the time identified them as being the 4th biggest outlier on that list, being chosen much less often than far worse civilizations. It seems like the devs also noted the disconnect and wanted to give Slav something a bit more unique, and at this point shifted more emphasis toward their Boyar, perhaps as an attempt to give that unit a bit more play and the civ as a whole more flavor. Improvements included more Pierce armor, followed afterward with more melee armor for the elite version, and later a cost reduction. The next major overhaul was then with the dynasties of India, where the Bengalis poached the Slavs' unique tech Orthodoxy as a civ bonus for +3 armor on monks, with Slavs then gaining their new Castle Age unique tech Detonets to discount the stone cost when building extra castles. All of this, if anything together, made them a little stronger, but a year later they received another round of small buffs, with a discount on their Druzhna unique tech for infantry, and Gambesons was added to the game, given to Slavs for free as a follow-up to getting free supplies. Combined, these techs are much more impactful for the champion line than the original free tracking for infantry back in HD. A few months later, they then lost access to Fervor, while having that swapped out with a free stronger version, giving their monks 20% faster movement. It felt like Slavs were winning every patch, but the big one would come in October 2023, when their farming bonus was restored from 10% to 15%. This rocketed them from the middle of the pack to knocking on the door of top 10, though even at the time, it was again notable that there was somewhat of a disconnect between their top tier performance and still pretty middling popularity in terms of pick rate. They have come down a bit in the rankings since then, settling around 15th in the standings on the ladder today, or a little above average. That point in and of itself, though, is an interesting commentary on the presence of power creep in the game. Remember, prior to Definitive Edition, they were number 2 in win rate at 57%, leading to their farming nerf, which has now been reversed, along with a variety of other tweaks to Boyars and their infantry and monks that I wouldn't suspect have made them worse as a whole, other than their monks having less armor. The Civ is at least as good as they were in HD or better, yet are now out of the top 10, at just a little under a 51% win rate recently. The balance of the game is so good these days that we never see the extremes that we did on HD, but it's clear what used to be enough to make a Civ top tier probably wouldn't cut it anymore, or alternately, maybe Slavs just don't fit the meta as well as they used to. In fairness, the appearance of power creep may actually have less to do with the pumping up of the strongest civs, and instead more to do with buffs given to the weakest civs, so they can't be beaten up on anymore and inflate the best civs ratings. Either way, that'll do it for this episode of Through the Ages. Big thanks to James, Jared2142, Justin, Samantha, Shawarma Rider, Steven, Woodruff, and everyone else on Patreon for their incredible support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.